Now, of course, once we declared war, we had to prepare for war. So the U.S. began to prepare very quickly for war. An army had to be raised. New recruits had to be trained, and troops and supplies had to be shipped to the front. On May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, requiring all men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register to be drafted into the armed services. Now, of course, eventually we would see that age dropped to 18, and then amidst the course of the Vietnam War, when soldiers could be drafted, but yet they weren't old enough to vote, they lowered the voting age to 18. But at this point in time, the draft age was between 21 and 30, and in the summer of 1917, new recruits reported for training, but they found almost nothing ready for them. Many soldiers slept in tents until barracks could hastily be built. And instead of rifles, they oftentimes had to use wooden sticks, or they had to use barrels instead of horses for training. Certainly not an ideal situation. The American forces that went to Europe were members of the American Expeditionary Force, led by General John J. Pershing. Now, this is the same General John J. Pershing who led the U.S. Expeditionary Forces into Mexico, where they spent 11 months searching to no avail for Pancho Villa. But, of course, he was pulled off of that to focus on the war in Europe. And he ends up leading the Americans, who become known as doughboys. And this group in which he led included the regular army, troops from the National Guard, and a larger force of new recruits of volunteers and draftees. So the first Americans arrived in June of 1917. To transport them safely, Pershing used the convoy system, where troop transports were protected by destroyers and cruisers. This was, of course, necessary to protect them from being sunk by the German U-boats. The presence of Americans gave a huge morale boost to the Allied forces. You have to keep in mind, this war had been going on for 4 years. All sides were getting tired and wanted a way out. And then here comes the United States with fresh new troops who are enthusiastic and excited. This is a nice boost for the Allied cause. At the same time, it puts incredible pressure on the Central Powers. And we still face some setbacks, though. For example, Russia did withdraw from the war shortly thereafter. One group of Americans that fought over in the war were the Harlem Hellfighters. These were members of the 369th Infantry, and they fought alongside the French. These African-American soldiers were awarded by the French for their bravery. Also during the course of the war, a genocide took place in the former Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks committed a genocide against their Armenian population. The reason being is that the Armenians were mostly Christian, and there was a great fear that the Armenians would side with Russia, another Christian nation, against their Muslim rulers, the Ottoman Turks. Now, this is still a very controversial issue in Turkey today. They still deny that it was a genocide. They say it was a civil war and that atrocities were committed on both sides. But many nations do recognize this as a genocide, which means a race murder, although the term genocide didn't exist at the time of the war. But clearly, Americans recognized this as a race murder. The Americans had a major impact on the war effort. On July 15, 1918, the Germans launched their last desperate offensive of the war. At the Second Battle of the Marne, the U.S. blew up the bridge that the Germans had built across the Marne River. And Germany had to retreat, having suffered 150,000 casualties. The Americans had the Germans on the defensive. For more than a month, they pushed northward through the rugged Argonne forest. In the Battle of the Argonne, the U.S. suffered some 120,000 casualties. But the war was crippling the German economy. Food riots broke out in Germany, and revolution spread across Austria-Hungary. Keep in mind, Austria-Hungary was this multi-ethnic empire many of these different nationalistic groups were now pushing for independence. And they saw an opportunity, as the countries bogged down in this war, to break free and experience self-rule. The Central Powers had problems encouraging their soldiers to fight. So in early November, Austria-Hungary signed a peace agreement with the Allies. On November 7th, the Germans began negotiating a peace agreement with the French. And on November 11th, an armistice went into effect and the guns of war fell silent. Celebration was muted by the tragedies of war. In all, more than 8.5 million had lost their lives during the course of the war.